Hi, it's Daniel again with the third of my How I Search for Concordance videos. In this video, we'll once again search for a compound subject with singular verbs. This time, however, we'll rely on the syntax module tagging for the Greek New Testament. As before, let's look at the example text and the characteristics on which we'll base the search. Alright, so this should be looking very familiar now. Underneath the quote is the list of properties. I've modified the first one to indicate that we'll be using the syntax module's compound subject tags to find the pair of substantives. Previously we used the within command to specify distance. The overall length of the construction will be constrained by the containing clause. No conjunction will be specified because the compound subject will render that unnecessary. The substantives being nouns will also be dropped from this query. Alright, let's have a look at what it looks like in accordance. Okay, in the Sin1 tab here over on the right, I have the search. And there's the containing clause, there's any clause. Underneath it is a compound subject. This is created by dragging subject here and then double clicking on it and selecting compound, and then you'll get the -c. And then there's a predicate with a singular verb next to that. A few things I'd like to point out before we get going on the search is that the scope is set to chapter, which is a requirement of the syntax searches. I have the syntax chart open here, which is useful for trying to understand how the constructions are modeled and thus how to look for, how to modify the search if we need to. And finally, over here in the actual search itself, I have the depth set to 1. I usually try to set it to 1 or 0 first and see what I get, and then increase it a little at a time. Increasing it will almost always lead to more false positives. Alright, so let's go through the hits that we get for this. 518 is new, we haven't previously seen it. Ioda en emia kere ume parelthe. So this is a perfectly valid hit. But one thing that's interesting is that just before it is another valid hit. Parelthe o urnos ke. And this is indeed a compound subject. But the reason it's not highlighted is that the verb precedes the compound subject. And you'd have to make some changes to find such cases as well. But for the time being, we'll proceed with just the verb following the compound. Another point to note is, why did we never see this valid hit, this iota and not passing away from the law? Because we looked at the conjunction and we'd removed care, and indeed it's not care, but it still didn't find it. And if you look at the instant details here, you'll see that it's actually tagged as a particle. And so that's why this did not show up. If you have a look at 619, and in particular 620, 619 obviously is the one we've seen. 620 we saw when we removed care, and that's because ute is considered a coordinating conjunction, is tagged as such in the instant details here at the bottom of the window. Again, in 1225 we have a particle rather than a conjunction. But as you go on, you see more and more of these cases, and we're not seeing very many false positives. In fact, we're not seeing any right now. Luke 20, 30, and 31 is interesting, and the reason this is interesting is because we never saw it before, and we were never going to, and that's because this compound subject spans the boundary of two verses, 2030 and 2031. But it is a compound subject and a singular verb, and thus a valid hit. And so we find it with the syntax search. So that's another advantage of the syntax searches, which is that they can search across verse boundaries like this. Alright, comparing the simple construct search results with the syntax ones, we'll use the same approach as we used for comparing the construct to the search box query. So, and we'll compare first in one direction and then in another. So here we have the construct search, not the syntax, and then syntax, not the construct. All right. So, if we have a look in here, we start seeing various false positives that we're already familiar with. The wineskins, the predicate nominatives associated with the gluttonous drunkard, the predicate nominatives associated with who is my brother and my sister and my mother, and so it goes on. But if we keep looking, suddenly we come across Mark 441. And it's like, why is that here? Looking at the structure of the syntax is going to be required at this point to see what, why this is excluded. This is our example. Why is it excluded? So cross highlighting here shows us this is the portion of the syntax, and this is our enclosing clause. So it'll be this any clause. And then we've got a predicate with the singular verb, which is true, and we have a compound subject. But why didn't we find it? And the answer is we've got an intervening additional layer. We've got this care is included in here, and it's introduced an additional layer. And so depth equals 1 won't find it. Increasing the depth to 2 will find it, but there will be additional side effects. So let's take a look at running that. With depth equals 2, let's go back to the syntax tab here. With depth equals 1, we get 70 hits in 39 verses. All right. Let's push up the depth and rerun it. Now we get 81 verses and 180 hits. Let's first check that we actually get Mark 441, and we do. So fantastic. So that demonstrates that the depth there is required. But we start to get additional hits. So for example, we get 11, 13, 11, 14, which is wrong. We've got a complex structure, but we're getting the wrong verbs highlighted here. In addition, 21, 14 is interesting because we've got plural here in what looks like a compound subject, but the verb is here. This is the plural verb right here at the beginning of 21:14, not that he healed them, as shown later. And in fact, you can see it's a compound verb, compound subject, but that the verb is this plural here, not this one here. So this is a mistake, a false positive. Now, one thing that you can do with syntax when you're playing with depth to avoid problems like this, if you have a look at this, what's happened is it's ended up looking from the depth way up here, finding this one, but then linking it to this predicate over here. So because it's been able to look from a slightly higher vantage point, it's ended up pushing the depth a little, pushing further wide than it should have, and found the wrong verb. It's because it hasn't really constrained the depth into the same sort of clause boundaries. So one thing you can do is try setting the limit the depth to clause boundaries, and then try that again. And now we're back to 44 verses where we'd previously had only 39, so we've gone up a little bit, and we've still got 441, which is nice, but we don't have the problems that we've had with Matt 1113 or 2114. And we do, however, still have Mark 7.3, which is probably for a different reason. So one thing you can do if you have to increase the depth is try and constrain the search depth to apply within clause boundaries, which will help keep the predicates within the right place in our query and in other queries. And as a consequence, you do a lot better. And you'll notice as you go through these that a lot of these hits are very good. So the key points to take away from this are that the syntax tagging will give you a great deal more accuracy if the syntax feature or the syntax models represent the feature that you're looking for, in this case compound subjects. The depth setting can be very important, and if you're going to play with that, you'll want to be mindful of the constraint to clause boundaries. You still will get false positives and false negatives, and particularly you will get them more readily if you don't constrain your depth in some cases. The accuracy of the search will depend on what the syntax tagging says. So if you are looking for things using the syntax model and the tagging does not view the construction the way you view it, for example, say you're looking for cases of apposition but they've been handled as adjuncts or whatever, you're not going to see them, and so you have to be mindful of the fact that you're working to a degree with something that has someone's interpretation on it, which is true of all tagging, but the higher up the stack you get, the more at odds with it you may find yourself. But at the same time, you will get much more accurate results in a case like this, where the compound subject is tagged and is thus very easy to find. So I hope that run through of this particular example and the various ways you can approach it in accordance and the pros and cons of each was helpful. Thanks for watching.